everyone. Welcome to the distinguished lecture series of the anthropologist Michael Herzfeld at the Colégio de São Bento of the University of Coimbra. My name is Gonçalo Santos. I'm a social cultural anthropologist based at the University of Coimbra. I will be the moderator of this evening's event, and it is my privilege indeed to present a good friend and who happens to be one of the most influential anthropologists today. So I think we are up for an intellectual treat this evening. I can tell you for sure because I had some glimpses at the slides already. But before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I'd like to thank the people and the institutions that made this event possible. The event is an initiative of the Research Cluster Technoscience, Society and the Environment of CIEJ, Research Center for Anthropology and Health at the University of Coimbra, in collaboration with a number of institutions. I'm going to have to name them just for the record: SAGE 20, Center of 20th Century Interdisciplinary Studies, also at the University of Coimbra, Department of Life Science and the Institute of Interdisciplinary Research, also at the University of Coimbra, and the SciTech Asia International Research Network. I would like to thank all these institutions and the people that lie at the core of these institutions for making the event possible. And special thanks due to Mr. Rawan Yahai, who is just behind you, filming the event and also giving backstage support. But let us move for the main reason why we are all here today. Michael Herzfeld is Ernest E. Monred Research Professor of the Social Sciences in the Department of Anthropology at Harvard University. He is the author of 12 books. The two most recent are Siege of the Spirits, Community and Polity in Bangkok, dating from 2016, and Subversive Archaism, Troubling Traditionalists and the Politics of National Heritage, published in 2021. Two films as well. He's also a director of two films: Monty Moments, 2007, and Roman Restaurant Rhythms from 2011, which we had the opportunity to see with students here at the Department of Life Sciences. Michael is a member of the editorial boards of American Ethnologists, Ethnologie Française, an international journal of heritage studies, and so on and so forth. He has served as editor of American Ethnologists and is currently editor-at-large at Anthropological Quarterly. His work has been, or is being, translated into several languages. It's a long list of languages that I'm not going to name, but that includes also Portuguese. Some of his books are available in Portuguese. And in his first distinguished lecture here in Coimbra last Thursday, Michael offered his comparative reflections on what he calls crypto-colonialism, or dominion in disguise. Today he will take us right into the complexities of anthropological fieldwork and the complex dilemmas of engagement faced by anthropologists. Let me just remind everyone that this event is being recorded and will be subsequently disseminated via social media. Michael will talk for approximately 50 to 60 minutes, I believe, and there will be a Q&A session just after the talk. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Michael Herzfeld. The talk this evening is entitled Urban Ethnography and Accidental Activism. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Gonzalo. It's a pleasure to be back here, and while I can't claim that the lecture will be quite as distinguished as the title makes it sound, I will do my best at least to be entertaining. Actually, the subject is a slightly sad one, and you will see that at the end of my talk, I actually will be talking about the limitations of what anthropologists could do. But let me start at least on a somewhat optimistic note by saying that in my own work, and there are many kinds of engaged anthropologists, you'll see in a moment, in my own work, really the main focus has been an interface between anthropology on the one hand and design, including planning and architecture on the other. It's probably no coincidence that in the final years of my full-time employment at Harvard, most of my graduate students were dealing with spatial issues. One of the complaints anthropologists always have about architects is that they don't pay any attention to social structure, but architects have a very nice form of revenge because they say, yes, and anthropologists don't pay any attention to structure at all. So, which is not quite true, especially as structuralists. But leaving wordplay aside, there is some truth in the mutual recrimination that in these two areas there is, I wouldn't say profound ignorance so much as an uneasy awareness of not having tried to master what the other side is doing. And I see my own task now in this relatively late stage of my career as trying to ignite a more productive dialogue with architects and planners, and I'm particularly glad that in the audience today there are people with whom that conversation is clearly beginning. And I want to thank Gonzalo Santos for having been so helpful in orchestrating this new beginning. And I think that in a city as blessed with amazing traditional as well as modern architecture as Coimbra, we actually can do some very interesting thinking about why certain forms of spatial organization are more or less suited to forms of social organization. Today, my topic is a little bit more limited. I'm going to talk about how anthropologists get involved in helping their communities. When I was young, that's quite a long time ago, we were told rather firmly by our mentors that we should never get involved politically, emotionally, or in any other way, with our communities. That somehow we had to be objective. Now, had I only had the right vocabulary at the time, I would of course have responded, as I do now, that this kind of Cartesian thinking, the separation of the objective and the subjective, is a culturally and historically very narrow perspective that we really should have rejected long ago. It's amazing to me that people still use words like objective and subjective, but then we also hear in heritage studies talk of tangible and intangible heritage, all of these kinds of binarisms that are themselves the product of, I would argue, a colonial mindset, them and us. Paul Rabiner, one of the few fellow anthropologists to have taken architecture seriously, points out, for example, that in the colonial planning of North African cities, one sees very clearly them, us, the Cartesian logic applied to the domination of the natives by the colonizers. The natives were stuck up in the Medina, and in Coimbra, of course, you know historically what that means, and on the other hand, the colonizers had their rather boring grid patterns which corresponded to objective planning. Now, I don't think any architect or anthropologist would be quite so crass today, but those habits of mine do not go away very easily, and I see it as my, I don't want to use the word crusade because it has all wrong associations, but shall we say, my goal is to try to contribute to undoing that mindset. So, why accidental activism? Because what I'm going to be calling engaged anthropology is not something you go into deliberately, it's something that happens to you. And it happens to you because you go into fieldwork with an open mind. One of the problems that some of the more scientifically inclined social scientists have with anthropologists is they often don't know when they go into the field what they're going to find, because after all, it is a voyage of discovery. And somehow this gets forgotten so that our poor graduate students have to write grant proposals, for instance, and we have to do the same thing, in which we pretend that we know what we're going to find. In reality, of course, everybody understands that this is a fiction designed to get us the money to get into the field and actually find something. So, many of you will have come across the term applied anthropology, and I wish to dissociate myself very firmly from that, not because it's always a bad thing, but because it often is. So applied anthropology involves a kind of activism and sometimes it can be useful. Obviously, if a government is sending food relief and they want to send it to a society with certain kinds of food taboos, it's very useful for that organization to know what the taboos are. If they don't know, they're going to send food that won't get eaten, they're going to get very angry, and the people are going to die of starvation. So there is some applied anthropology, some very basic applied anthropology that is useful. But it is activism that is controlled almost always by an institution. You do your applied anthropology because somebody's asked you to apply your anthropology. The field research involved in it follows a self-commitment to do just that. You're going to go in there and do good in some way. This means that your critical intellectual independence is compromised right from the start. You know you're an employee and you have to do more or less what you set out to do. There's not going to be much of a voyage of discovery there. And the result is that if you're working for a government or a bank, not only are you going to be doing exactly what they want, but you're also going to be subject to the kind of auditing that nowadays, of course, has become commonplace everywhere. Everything is audited these days, from student evaluations and professors' performances to obviously anything financial, but also this terrible thing that bureaucrats like to call excellence. And what that means is that, again, there's very little space for critical thinking. Now, that may be a good thing in some circumstances. I am not just dismissing applied anthropology out of hand, but I think we need to know what its limitations are. As I said, I will finish this lecture by talking about the limitations of engaged anthropology, but I want to show a larger universe that I think engaged anthropology well engages. So first of all, yes, it permits activism accidentally. You're in the field having decided to do research on some topic. What happened to me was that I was interested in the impact of historic conservation regulations on the way in which people understood the past. Very clear. What do people think authenticity is all about? What do they think history and heritage are all about? Do they even use those terms? Do they agree with officialdom when officials come along and say you can't make any changes to your house because it's on a registered list or because it has characteristics of a certain period? Then, when you're in the field, you realize that these people have some much deeper complaint and you try to do something about it. Perhaps initially not even being very aware that you're being pulled into that argument. When I first went to the community of Pom Nahakan in Bangkok, the residents immediately, now I had been actually very frustrated because I thought that I was not getting anywhere with my fieldwork. I wanted to study the impact of historic conservation on collective memory and discovered that people had no time to talk to me. Until one day I was taken to a demonstration at Pom Nahakan about which I had heard. I'd never been there before. And I pricked up my ears immediately because two people were talking with loudspeakers about the problems of the community and saying, and our community is a historic community with a tremendous investment in the past of this country, and so on and so forth. Oh, they're talking about history. Maybe this is relevant. Then, to my embarrassment, I'd given my card to somebody at the entrance. One of them looks at the card and says, and proof that our cause is now attracting international attention is the fact that we have, my pronunciation of my name, Professor, what is it, what will you do to help us? And thank goodness I had the presence of mind to say, I don't know, because I don't know anything about your problems yet. And I'm not a politician, and I'm therefore not going to promise you anything. But if you will help me collect some data, maybe I'll get a better idea of what's going on. And if I think that you have a good cause, maybe I'll help you. I'm just not willing to make promises out of the blue, because I'm not a politician. It was the best answer I could have given. It was totally accidental. It turned out that they were fed up to the teeth with politicians and kept promising everything just before elections and would disappear. Yes, I know you have those in Portugal as well. They happen everywhere. I think that's part of the definition of politicians. And these people had clearly been suffering for a very long time. So accidentally, I came across this set of problems. Therefore, my engagement with their problems, which I'll talk about later on, derives from my field research, rather than having me go in to work in the field to figure out how to solve a particular problem. I wanted to be free to be critical of them too. And by the way, this community was remarkable in that way. They would send me to talk to their enemies in the bureaucracy as often as they would try to persuade me of the rightness of their cause. And that actually made them much more convincing. I can't imagine anybody, certainly in Greece or Italy, ever doing that, but in Thailand it turned out it was quite common. And so I was able to be independent both of any pressure from their side, but also of my own teachers who had told me never get involved. I couldn't help it. I found myself ineluctably drawn into this conflict, and I think that this is also simply a question of conscience. I am never going to say to a fellow anthropologist, you have to get involved, but I think that if you want to have the privilege of studying a group of people and you discover A, that they're suffering, and B, they would like to have your help, you really do have a moral obligation to see what you can do to help them. And finally, I would say that anthropologists in general as a profession are very much opposed to the regulation of knowledge through audit culture, as it has been called by a number of very distinguished anthropologists, including Chris Shaw and Susan Wright, and Truthern. And we are especially critical in the present moment, of course, of neoliberal economics, because neoliberal economics, whatever else it may be, is an economic ideology that says the weak go to the wall and it's their own fault. It's called responsibilization, if you want a nice long word for it. In other words, they're made responsible for their own sufferings. And clearly, this disadvantages the already disadvantaged even more. It's a vicious circle. The Wren Foundation, which is a marvelous institution, and I think the only foundation in the world that is totally dedicated to the funding of anthropology, in one way they continue their good work, in 2010 published a set of articles in a special issue of the journal Current Anthropology, which is funded also by the foundation, on engaged anthropology. And if you look at the titles, you'll see that they cover a fairly wide range of topics. I'm sorry, I went the wrong way. Social criticism, well, obviously we're all involved in that. But then, how can anthropological commentary help rethink the priorities in education? There's my piece on gentrification, which I'm going to talk about more today. There are questions of what we mean by security, and this is in recent conversations here in Coimbra involving Professor Santush, I've also been talking about insecurity as itself a very important topic, and why are people precarious? What other forms of insecurity are produced along with precarity? And how can anthropologists comment on them? There are also issues of race and class and gender that anthropologists are uniquely qualified to address because of their fieldwork, poverty, of course, and dealing with the burden of a conflicted past. In case of one of these essays about Hong Kong, the question of how to deal with the colonial past, and of course now with the sort of crypto-colonial present, I suppose one could say. So, for my understanding of engaged anthropology, if we're going to talk about the intersection of planning, architecture, and anthropology, the key issue is housing. Where to put people and what kind of dwellings are we going to make for them, or are we going to listen to how they design them or would design their own dwellings and simply encourage our architects to contribute their knowledge to make those structures more viable in material and aesthetic terms. Now, the question of housing is vital today because more people are made homeless in most industrialized countries every year. I I know that in Rome, for example, 16,000 people per year more are made homeless. This is in a city which claims to have all sorts of charitable institutions. It doesn't help. I have been struck, when I came to Portugal as a child, I was struck by the number of beggars because in those days Portugal was a very poor country. Today I'm struck again by the number of beggars, but I think they represent something different. They represent a rising tide of homelessness even in a place like Coimbra. So we need to think about why that's happening. Now, most national constitutions have some clause about the dignity of the citizen being respected. And most of them then go on to define dignity in a fairly material sense, that is, having a roof over your head. I think that although there is no such thing as a universal value, at least from an anthropological perspective, this comes about as close as it can. And yet, the laws to protect the dignity that constitutions insist on are usually very, very weak. It's very easy for economically powerful actors to evict, or to demolish, or simply to disperse. And the people who suffer in all of these cases are those who are marginalized because they don't already belong to a powerful elite. Poor people, minorities, immigrants, those with lower levels of education, which limit their access to all sorts of legal and economic resources. Anthropologists used to study only those weak people, but that was a big mistake, and we've reformed a little bit, I think, in that regard. We now study elites as well. And they don't like it very much because we begin to get intimate knowledge of, for example, how bureaucrats operate, how academics operate, how people in considerable positions of power operate. And this is sometimes called studying up, that you are actually looking at people who are more powerful than you are and trying to understand their values. But it's an absolutely necessary component if we are going to deal with the bureaucratic regulation of poverty, marginalization, and all the rest of it. And so when I was doing research in Rome and in Bangkok, these are my two main sites dealing with the problems of eviction, I spent most of my time talking to people who were fighting the act of being evicted, but I also spent quite a lot of time talking with the bureaucrats who were involved in doing it. Sometimes, I have to admit, I felt a certain bile rising in my throat from the, well, heartless things they would say. We are improving the neighborhood. It is our job to improve the quality of life in this city, meaning, in other words, get rid of the riffraff. Whereas, obviously, as an anthropologist, my sympathies tended to be more with the riffraff. But, and I think this is important, bureaucrats are human beings too. Many bureaucrats are well-intentioned, but find that their intentions are stymied by their superiors or by laws that they are powerless to change. And especially in this age of the neoliberal economy, that dilemma is becoming more and more serious. They are also victims of a class struggle. So my personal engagements, those of you who have taken the class with me in the last 2 weeks, will be familiar with much of this, and I apologize to them for the repetition. But I think it's worth mentioning that the earlier work that I did on gentrification actually was a happier story. It was in the town of Rethymno on the north coast of Crete. I was looking at the economic and social impacts of historic conservation in a town where, in fact, most people turned out to be owners of their own properties and therefore couldn't be evicted. So right there, you have an interesting clue where the real problem of gentrification lies. It's a question, most often, of ownership. And it seems to me that real reform can only come about when families are allowed to own their own property in some way that can't be interfered with some story about the land itself belonging to someone else. And you'll see a sad story about that in Bangkok. Now, I then came to do research in the oldest part of the historic city center of Rome, the Monti, which is the area between Santa Maria Maggiore and the Colosseum, in and saw there how religious institutions and economic institutions often converged precisely to use ideologies of responsibilization on the one side and the ennobling effects of poverty on the other to justify what was an increasingly cruel situation. And I might add that the very well-established and often very well-heeled politicians of the left were at least as culpable, surprisingly to me, as those of the right. Really, the ideology of the politicians had less to do with the way they behaved than their own very comfortable conviction that they knew that they were right. The year after, I found myself caught up through my association with one of my old students with a move at Harvard University to do something about the appalling conditions, or the really bad pay in particular, that the sort of menial staff, as it were, the people who did the washing and the cleaning and the drying and worked in the kitchens, were getting. This was a movement initiated by undergraduates. It was then joined by a number of graduate students, and one of them was the student of mine who pulled me. I was one of a very small group of faculty who worked with the students to try to persuade the university to allow their workers to unionize and to accept a higher wage for all of them. Because the problem was not just one of money. The problem was that as Harvard gentrified the area, the land around it, the difficulty of finding affordable housing was growing, with the result that people were having to live further and further out. I'm simplifying the process, but essentially that's what happened. And I suddenly realized that there was a real parallel here between what was happening at Harvard and what, for example, I had seen in Brasilia, where this slick middle-class city is maintained by a huge force of workers who are bussed out to some unmentionable suburbs way out in the jungle as soon as the day's work is over. And again, the distances they have to travel are pretty frightening. So here you have a spatial element that already becomes very important. That is the question of geographical distance. And I think that's something that anthropologists have often ignored. In the meantime, I'd begun to think about doing research in Thailand, and as I say, ended up being pulled into this Omakan community on the day that I described. Having been asked, what would you do to help us, I, of course, then went on thinking about that, and eventually, as you'll see, got involved, not because I could do very much as a foreigner, very different, as then a British citizen and EU citizen. That was before Boris Johnson threw everything away, but anyway, I felt that I had participatory rights in Italy. In Thailand, it was simply a matter of these people had become my friends, and I felt very committed to giving something in exchange for the fact that they were giving me a lot of information that was useful to my career. So this is from these are actually photographs taken by someone else for the Living Wage campaign. I think that is actually my former student leading out there. He made a film of the whole thing, which then played on Japanese television, and it's called Occupation. I'm sure you can find it somewhere if you're interested. But in thinking about these events and thinking about my own research, I began to focus on the literature that already existed and was very critical of what used to be called urban renewal, and which increasingly now is called gentrification, a term that recognizes the class-based nature of this kind of struggle. And particularly in the work of the late Neil Smith, who was sort of an anthropologist / geographer. Now, as I said before, the key issue is who owns the land. If people are renters, they are in a much weaker position, whereas if they are legal owners of the land, or at least of the fabric of their houses, they are in a much stronger position to fight back. They often lack the organizational as well as the economic means to mobilize. When they get those possibilities, when they find themselves able to mobilize, it doesn't always guarantee success. But what is also important, even when they fail, is the idea that someone cared enough to try to work with them, to avert disaster long enough so that they could find some other alternative solutions. Now, changes in land value have often had a disastrous impact on populations. When land becomes valuable, suddenly poor people have very few defenses. And one way in which those defenses are broken down is through the very common aestheticization of the problem. That is, we will beautify this area, and to beautify it we have to remove unsightly buildings and especially unsightly people. There's often very little distinction made between what people look like and what their dwellings are like. And governments, whether local or national, are very apt at that point to start a process that I have called spatial cleansing. Some of you are familiar with that concept. Arjuna Padarai calls it, also calls it urban cleansing, but I like spatial cleansing, which happens in the countryside as well, where you first move people out and then you declare the space from which they are moved as monumental space, as national monument. Usually some kind of national pride is invoked as an excuse for this kind of mistreatment. And you create a moral panic, very often in collaboration with the media, about the people who are being pushed out of those areas. Every major city has some process of this kind. And for those of you who are familiar with Brazil, Teresa Caldeira has written a very important work, City of Walls, which she shows that this process begins to reach further and further up in the financial hierarchy, and people who were once considered to be fairly safe are now right on the edge of being of becoming characterized as a dangerous population as a prelude to their being. So the question then is, who gets to define that moral space? Well, again, if we look at the background, and particularly look at the issue of rent, we see that there are some very complex matters involved, which, again, architects are not going to look at unless they have come to realize that what they describe as space is also the focus of some sort of moral struggle. So, in one case at least, I know of a house in Rome where the residents were evicted after a very long struggle, and the excuse always was that we are a charitable institution because we're a religious institution, therefore when we provide housing for priests, which could then be converted very easily into a profit-making hotel, even then the money comes back into the church. This is therefore by definition beneficial. It is an act of charity. And of course the whole idea that suffering ennobles the soul is always invoked along with the noble character of poverty. As I'm going to be talking about Thailand, I might remind you that it's not only the Vatican that says that poverty ennobles the soul. The late King Rama IX of Thailand, Bhumibol, also developed an economic philosophy he called the sufficiency economy, whereby he said that we should be satisfied with what we have, however little it may be. But I should remind you that at the time of his death, he was the second or third wealthiest man in the world. So I think that speaks for itself. Now, there's a lot of symbolism in these things, but one argument that is sometimes made for eviction is that it's not done by the Vatican. In Rome, for example, it's done by local lay fraternities. What people also are not often aware about is that as people sink further and further into debt because the global economy is making ordinary living arrangements more and more difficult, they turn, the banks won't help them, but the banks are already colluding in the background with money loan sharks who actually then can gouge a lot of money out of these people in the false hope, as it usually turns out to be that they can exit from the cycle of debt, and the suicide rate among those who do fall prey to that sort of debt is amazingly high. Now, this also has an impact then on the dynamics of gentrification for obvious reasons. In Greece, we're not dealing so much with the Vatican, we're dealing with the Orthodox Church, which again controls very large parcels of land through the ownership of that land by various monasteries. All of these religious arrangements have been a prelude to something that we now see happening on a much bigger scale, and I don't think anyone's worrying very much about churches and religions anymore, because there are now much larger forces at work. In Greece, for example, but also in many parts of the world, I think also here in Portugal, from what I've been hearing, the Airbnb movement has pushed the price of property up very rapidly. Somebody's making a lot of money there, but it's not helping poor people find adequate housing close to where they live and work. And of course the golden visa is another problem, and it's a particularly big problem because it is going to create racial prejudice no matter what anyone says, simply because now many of those who are taking advantage of it are from China, in a time when there's already a good deal of suspicion of the Chinese. This is going to fuel racial prejudice, which is another problem that anthropology is particularly well equipped to address. So we have a package of issues that are related to each other. Let me take a look at Athens just to talk for a moment about something of a success story, and I'll take you very quickly then to Rethymno. So, as I mentioned to my students, there's a law that says, for reasons that are connected with Greece's crypto-colonial past, if you will, that no building may be tall enough to obscure the view of the Acropolis. This turned out to be the salvation of Athens, because after the war, the civil war that ended in 1949, there were a lot of displaced rural people who came to the city looking for work. Those who were qualified as builders, even fairly unskilled builders, quickly found work and were often paid through something called anthropological, which means basically they were paid for their labor with the promise of an apartment, or sometimes 2 or 3 apartments, which not only allowed them to live comfortably, to dower their daughters, and perhaps with a 3rd apartment get some rent. That was technically illegal, but a lot of them did it. As a result, Athens today is made up almost entirely of 6-story buildings, and as the architect Kenneth Frampton has pointed out, 6 stories is exactly the right height to allow eye contact between the top level and the street. So Jane Jacobs' famous line about eyes on the street actually works in a place like Athens, which otherwise looks very much like any old modern city, but has a much livelier street life than many other big cities. And that's the reason. Well, as you see, meanwhile, the Parthenon gets refurbished. There are parts of Athens that were contested even quite a long time ago. This is an area that looks a bit like a Cycladic island. It's not surprising because it was built by workers who migrated here from the island of Anarchy, and they had a big conflict with the archaeologists who were trying to preserve the lower regions of that space dominated by the Acropolis. But then it was decided that this too was a form of heritage, and that allowed Anarchaetica to be retained. Now the problem is that at that point, Anarchaetica became fashionable. Artists moved in, the poor people were pushed out again because they had no legal title to their land, and today Anarchaetica is a bohemian neighborhood of some prosperity, I would say. Okay, over to Rethymno, where the story is very different. So Rethymno, as you can perhaps see this picture, dominated by a citadel that was built under the Venetian Empire, so probably 15th to 16th centuries, and then refurbished and altered in various ways under the Ottomans. See the mosque in the middle of the citadel. A beautiful old town. And in 1974, a somewhat visionary, albeit right-wing mayor decided, this was still during the colonial regime, that he could use the tough hand of the military to make sure that nobody could make any changes. Now, people complained bitterly about it at the time, but interestingly enough, when he stood for election again many years later, the fact that people complained so much and the fact that he was associated with the military regime did not hurt him one bit. Why? Because in the end, the people of Bretano had experienced something that is unfortunately very rare, but could be an example for the rest of the world. And that is something I call self-gentrification. That is to say, because everybody, not everyone, most people living in the old town were actually owners of their houses. Some from many generations back, some were poor refugees from Asia Minor who arrived in the big exchange of populations in 1924, and then were given houses that had been vacated by other Muslims who had been shipped off to Turkey in that same exchange, but they were given the houses, they were given titles to the houses. Because they owned the houses, they could do more or less what they wanted with them, except they were not allowed to make changes to the facades. The result, this suddenly became more and more prosperous, more and more tourists started to come in, and the best way I can describe it to you is to tell you about our landlords, who went from not really understanding why we thought their front door was so beautiful. It was a lovely example, it is a lovely example of an early 17th century inscribed doorway with a date and the family name, and the coat of arms, 1609, and they went from being totally uninterested in any of that to boasting to passers-by of this wonderful Venetian architecture that also was home for their production of certain traditional Greek desserts, sweets like baklava, which they made on the premises, and so they were making quite a lot of money that way. Excuse me for 1 second, my throat is getting a little... So, they became prosperous, and the sign of that was when one day they started to tell us all about the vacations they had taken in Thailand. So you see real change, sort of bourgeoisification, but it happened on the spot. People themselves were never made to suffer by eviction. In fact, they were enabled by this situation, and I think there's a lesson to be learned from that. There's the citadel with a new town in front. These people had enough money after a while to buy property in the new town, which allowed them to buy a dower house for their daughter, usually an apartment. And so the new town also began to develop, and there is today a symbiotic relationship between the new and the old towns. The wonderful situation, very unusual. Old harbour, citadel at night. All right, I just wanted to put in a beautiful picture. But also you see the kind of ornamentation on the doorways, not unlike what you see in Coimbra, except this is from the Ottoman period, where you see quite a lot of, and also woodwork in the doors from, now again, in the old days this would have been thrown away, now it's preserved, it's tradition. So a good thing, capital G and a capital T. Neoclassical architecture, a Catholic church, there are Catholics on Crete, and actually an Italian order of monks. Neoclassical buildings from the 19th century, mixed in with these late Venetian, early Ottoman buildings, and some modern phenomena, including these incised designs on basically plaster surfaces, put there by people whose houses were very simple, illegally constructed, and built by people who could put nice tile work and painting on. When I went to see the then socialist archaeologist in charge of the local branch of the Archaeological Service, she said, oh, there's nothing to preserve there, they're not particularly aesthetically pleasing, which shows that even here, there were limits to the tolerance of what you might call working class cultural values. But still, there's room for discussion, and I find it interesting that most of these rather elaborate plaster designs are actually still in place. So somebody apparently either thought that they were worth keeping, or perhaps thought that they just weren't worth demolishing. But in any case, there's enough space in the city for people to be comfortable. So that's a success story. Now, Rome is very different. Here you see part of the problem. You have a city of great antiquity, the 17th century church, 12th or 13th century wall and turret, and in front of it housing that almost certainly was made possible by mafia involvement. Churches that certainly make a lot of money by promoting big business advertising, but are also the sites of protest, and you see the people at the top with their placards saying, homeless, senza casa. And this I want to juxtapose with my story about Bangkok, because these are two stories essentially of failure. That is, of two communities where in one small part of the Monty and in this rather small community in Bangkok, I did what I could to try to help communities resist the pressures to get out. The pressures in Rome were purely economic by this time. It was very clear that because most people had been renters for literally a century or more, and very low rents, because that's what the Vatican did as a way of maintaining the property. That is, they didn't put any money into the property, they didn't do any maintenance work, but they also charged low rent, so people had somewhere to stay, and they lived in a fairly amiable collaboration, cohabitation with wealthier people living often in the same streets, and they became mutually dependent, and so you had a pretty vibrant social existence. That was completely destroyed at the point when the rents began to rise very sharply. In one year, I think it was 1999 or 2000, I forget which, the rents in some parts of the Monty went up literally 10 times in 1 year. You can imagine what that means. In Bangkok, the situation is different. This is not gentrification as we normally understand it. This is a citadel that stands in front of the area where the community lived. The citadel itself is part of the old city wall, but the community was a group of people who had come there finding these houses that were already in existence unoccupied. They became squatters essentially. Some of them apparently did pay rents for a while, but again, in Bangkok for a very long time, rents had been held artificially low, not by any religious organization, but by the Crown Property Bureau, which is essentially the real estate office of the royal family. So we have some differences and some parallels. Now, the community was the subject of immediate interest when the authorities decided they wanted to evict. And the man who's being massaged is actually an archaeologist who decided that he too wanted to do something good for communities that were living in these old quarters. The masseur is somebody from the community, and on the right you see an architect who is taking notes. I think he's a student of architecture. He's taking notes, helping, because the equivalent of doing pro bono work in Thailand is what they call tambun. It's making merit in the Buddhist system. So you get to nirvana faster if you make merit. And so people actually, with various kinds of skills, private individuals, whether they're doctors or architects, or planners of various kinds, will bring those skills to help the local people, and that's what happened here. Community had frequent meetings. They organized a whole series of events and exhibitions to publicize that case. And I got involved around 2003. Now, I appeared fairly early on. They seemed to be quite comfortable with my videotaping. And this was an interesting occasion when I actually found myself being pulled into an advocacy role, which I was not really prepared for at that point. So again, getting back to the accidental activism here. I was filming this encounter. The man in the white shirt, at that time still very young looking, is the president of the community. The man in the light blue suit is a local politician. He's a Muslim, therefore a member of a minority, and that seemed to make him more sympathetic to the community. There are also 3 Muslim families in the community. The other people looking rather formally, not perhaps quite so approvingly at the whole operation are officials from the city hall. And the president is explaining to this politician how they envisage the development of the site. So what happened was that as we got to the end of the tour, the politician, as politicians always are, was followed by a bevy of journalists. And one of them said, well, you know, what about the community? How are they handling the situation? And he said, well, I don't know very much about the community here. Why don't you talk to the foreign anthropologist? And so I was filming. Suddenly, one of the residents took the video camera out of my hand, went on filming, pushed me forward, so I had no option but to give a totally impromptu press conference in Thai. It was quite an unnerving experience. I didn't have actually time to be scared, but having survived that experience and seeing that it actually gave the residents a certain sense of being supported, I thought, do more of this kind of thing. Why not? And so I helped them organize two conferences, one at Chulalongkorn, which is like the top university, the prestigious university in Thailand, one at Thammasat, which is a social science-oriented university. At the panel there, you see a very interesting collection of people. So in the middle is that same archaeologist now wearing a blue shirt. The man who's actually speaking next to him is the treasurer of the community. He's an insurance worker, so he's somewhat educated. He's one of the most educated people in the community, but he is a resident of the community. And then further along, the man with his chin on his hand like this is a member of the royal family who is an architect and who was very concerned that what was going to be destroyed was not just the community, but also a very interesting set of vernacular architecture from the 19th century. And, you know, this involvement went on a bit further. I found myself being interviewed, being pulled into meeting. This was a meeting of activists from about 16 communities in the area in which I was invited to speak. Kind of passionate there anyway. I was certainly became emotionally very involved. And I think it's stupid, frankly, for any anthropologist to claim he or she doesn't care. You may not like the community, you may not believe in their cause. We're all at liberty to come to whatever decisions we want. But I was seeing serious injustice going on all around me and felt absolutely that if I was going to be building my career by studying these people, the least I could do was to lend my voice to them. It might lead nowhere. In the end, we did not succeed. I think that it did something, at least, to restore some dignity to them, because what you should realize is that you can imagine the European equivalent to this. In the Thai context, these people were considered to be poor because they deserved to be poor, because in the logic of a kind of Protestant version of Buddhism that is now prevalent in Thailand, the fact of being poor is seen as evidence of having done something bad in a previous life. The same thing would be said of a person who belongs to an ethnic minority, and so on and so forth. So various prejudices that are then reinforced economically are justified in terms of the law of karma. Now, I'm coming to an end of this rather global romp through several cases. I hope the common themes are becoming clear. That is that there are many forms of engaged anthropology, including, for example, medical anthropology. But the kind of engaged anthropology that I found myself getting involved in as somebody who has always had a roof over his head, has always been able to be comfortable in various ways, why can't everyone have that right? It's a simple question. It's a moral question, and I feel that obligation to fight. But I feel the obligation emerges, as I said at the beginning of the talk, from my academic engagement. Now, the thing that pulls that all together, in my view, is our understanding of time and how it works. People who do conservation are interested in the long delay. They're interested in long periods of time, and they're interested in preserving elements of the passing of civilizations, of dynasties, whatever it may be, but they are chronicling in a material way the passage of history. In Thailand, it's done very much in terms of the reigns of different kings. So they talk about the 9th reign as the one that just ended. Now, there's another kind of time. It's what Bourdieu calls tempo. In other words, the rhythm of life, the way that people deal with situations from one moment to the next, the way that they play with time. And one example of playing with time is what both in Rome and in Bangkok was called buying time by various legal strategies, for example. Now, I see this as very similar to Michel de Certeau's now famous distinction between strategy and tactics. Bourdieu only talked about strategy, and de Certeau's point was strategy is what those who already have power design. Tactics are who you, without power, necessarily, you might have power, but you don't have to have tactics, you adapt to the situation. Anthropologists are necessarily tactical, because our discipline is opportunistic in the sense that we don't know what we're going to find, and when we find something interesting, it may divert us from our original plan of work. But it is a discovery procedure, and it's our ability exactly to move with the tempo of a particular social situation that allows us to identify hitherto unsuspected phenomena. Thus, when we look at historic conservation, if I were an art historian, I would probably be talking in terms of the periodization of time, the Ottoman period, the Venetian period, and so on, or the first reign, the second reign, the third reign, and there are various ways you can do it, but it would be a periodized time. Because I'm an anthropologist, I'm interested in the syncopation of time. I'm interested in the way the time gets distorted, played, gets moved around, how people will sometimes build up tension and do nothing and then suddenly act as a way of achieving a goal that might otherwise have been impossible. And I can describe those tactics exactly as accurately as somebody who could describe periods of history. That means that my professional tacticity, the fact that I am a tactical operator as a professional, enables me also to understand how those tactics work for ordinary people. And so, whereas the law tends to look as though it's timeless, or different laws have specific dates, but once they come into force, they have to be obeyed in absolute form, what we all know from our experience of dealing with any bureaucracy, in fact, is that the law is infinitely malleable, and it's the tactician, the good tactician, who gets what he or she wants out of the law, out of the bureaucracy. So the role of an engaged anthropologist, analytically speaking, is very much a matter of refocusing a formalized time as a kind of time that is practical, and in our own actions trying to see if we can help local people, if they want us to, it has to be with their, not just consent, but their volition, rethink the way that they have been oppressed by a rigid structure that is expressed in terms of temporal categories. And if we fail, to give them the means of a dignified retreat. I still want to think, and I think I can say this with some degree of confidence, that even though we failed in Bomaka, the community was evicted, was destroyed, the fact that I had written about it, the fact that I had given several interviews in Thai, as well as written about it in Thai and English, these were acts that gave back some element of dignity, and I had made a commitment that if at some point my presence is required again, they wanted to come back and help reconstitute the community in some other place, which they certainly are talking about doing. If they feel that my presence would be helpful, then certainly I would expect to do it. But I did say that I would end my lecture with a little reflection on limitations, because we shouldn't overestimate our ability to affect the world we live in. That's not an excuse for inaction. It's a call to realism. First of all, of course, we should never intervene unless the community wants us to. When the people in Pomahakana said, what will you do to help us? That was pretty obvious. They wanted the help, and they went on wanting the help. We can't always prevent disaster, so what we have to do is think beyond it. What happens next? What happens when these people are dispersed? I let it be known that I'm available. I don't know even now whether that will have any further consequences, but they should know that if it becomes necessary, I'll drop everything and go. Our contributions may seem quite unimportant at the time, but, and that can lead us to feel a deep sense of disappointment, but we shouldn't give in to that self-indulgence. I think over time we do make a cumulative difference, and we can do it in alliance with people who have made it their business to affect the march of events. So NGOs, civil service, civil society forces, and so on. Some of those NGOs are also not as pure as the driven snow. We find NGOs that are quite corrupt, and so some of those also may be the object of our negative commentary. We are independent operators, and that is what makes us useful. And even if the Pomahakana community is never reconstituted, what has happened at Pomahakana, the record of that is one very small part, and again, I don't want to exaggerate its importance. It is a very small part of a consciousness that is already making itself strongly felt in Thailand, because as many of you probably know, Thailand is boggling. I wouldn't dare actually wear this shirt in Thailand because it's associated with the revolutionary forces that are still quietly pushing against the regime. Finally, and this is the hardest one for human beings to accept in any situation, no solution we propose will ever be permanent, but some solutions are more lasting than others. And if there's some element of optimism in this rather pessimistic final comment, it's this, that if we can create a record that local people can use, if we can also initiate a discourse, a dialogue, so much of what we want to do here in this conversation that I've been having with several of you, a discourse that brings anthropologists, planners, and architects together, instead of treating them as hermetically divided and bureaucratically subdivided entities. If we can do any of that, then we are likely to be more effective, not necessarily in helping a particular community, but in avoiding situations of this kind in the future. It's at least what I hope we can try to do. I don't think that an anthropology without a moral commitment is an anthropology at all. The term anthropology has its roots in, on the one hand, in the ancient Greek word for gossip, but it also has a theological origin as the study of how humans can ennoble themselves. And to me, anthropology has a conscience. At times it may seem to act unethically. I have argued, for example, that the ethical rules that are laid down in various countries, including the whole of the European Union, for the conduct of research are in some ways quite unethical, and it's our job to propose them, and that's also kind of engaged anthropology. But we have a place in the world, and we will have a place in the world as long as we remember that moral commitments change, but we have to do what we think is right and expose that something to the criticism of those who disagree with us. Anthropology was, from its very inception, a multidisciplinary science. It remains that to this day, and it remains that precisely because it has a conscience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. I don't know if you'd like to sit there or just stand.
I'm happy to stand.
Okay. So I think I'm going to use my privilege as moderator to ask you a couple of questions. I mean, I really like the overall optimistic, upbeat tone that you're engaged in. I
I'm saying this in part as an anthropologist, as you know. One of our colleagues, Sherry Ortner, has perhaps very aptly coined the term dark anthropology to refer to much of what has been written about, some of the structures of exclusion and inequality behind, shaping neoliberal policies and so on and so forth. And of course, anthropology has been, a major voice, a major outlet for the voices of the oppressed, and so on and so forth. But that kind of analysis can be a little bit too dark, and one often gets a sense of a loss of hope and a loss of precisely what you mentioned, sense of initiative, movement, energy. So I pretty much enjoyed this optimistic, upbeat tone of your engaged anthropology, and perhaps it's engagement, to use again the word, with creating new visions of hope.
And you're a bot.
Yeah. But yes, one of the things that I often hear from students, especially the younger scholars, I would say, is a sense of impatience. A sense of impatience that perhaps has to do with the fact that there is a sense of also urgency, that many of the things and injustices and inequalities that we're talking about have not been changing for quite some time. Many of the young scholars that I'm mentioning are talking about urgent anthropologists. They are also feeling tempted to start actually going that other step of becoming activists themselves. Perhaps because they've been confronted with projects or collaborative projects in which they were confronted also with failure, pretty much like the situations that you described. So I wonder what you would say to this kind of younger generations of anthropologists that would be more tempted to kind of follow that track of activism. Would you warn them against some of the possible limitations and pitfalls that they're going to find on the way? Yeah.
Well, the first thing I'd warn them about is not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, we've seen in the last 20 years, for example, and most PhD students in anthropology don't want to go through a heavy labor of learning about kinship. And then they find themselves in a community where kinship is important, and they don't have the tools to work with it. So, while I'm not going to make an argument for staying with the same old, and indeed I would second something that you said to me, and I totally agree with you, that anthropologists will tend to write in a very obscurantist way. We need to get away from that as well. But I think there's a huge difference. First of all, we should realize that we can write in a number of different registers. When I'm writing for you, I can write theoretically and expect you to understand. When I'm writing for the public, I shouldn't be talking down to the public, which I think is a mistake that a lot of the popular writers make. But I should write in an accessible style and just, I always say, apply Occam's razor, get rid of any unnecessary jargon, and try to say things succinctly and clearly. Now let me give you an example. So I happen to be very interested in kinship, and I'm particularly interested in the significance of patrilineal clan organizations in nation states that don't approve of it, of which of course Greece is an example. And the guys I study out in the mountains of Crete are organized in clans, and they get into terrible trouble for it. Why is this important? Well, first of all, it's important because it helps us to understand why they're an object of suspicion to the state. Second, it helps us to understand how they can amass very large numbers of votes and thereby help to corrupt politicians who ought not to be swayed by this sort of thing if they follow their own principles. And we can then talk about both sides of the equation. We don't start out by being do-gooders. That doesn't work. It's part of my argument. We start out by being seriously interested in an academic, analytical problem. We then discover that it has enormous ramifications for understanding social life. Now let me take the clan thing a little further. Remember the Bosnian War. Did you ever read a single article that mentioned clan identity as a problem? Now think what happened. Serbia invaded parts of Bosnia and Croatia, the Serbian soldiers raped a very large number of women who were then sequestered and put on suicide watch until they gave birth to the children, which were immediately snatched away from them, and then after that the soldiers didn't care what happened to these women, many of whom did commit suicide because of the shame of having lost, having been raped by these men. And the same thing happened the other way around. The groups were doing it, the different ethnicities were doing it to each other. I would argue that, and it was the one group that did comparatively less of that were the Bosnians themselves. The Bosnians are not as strongly organized in patrilineal clans, right? So we can see that had somebody said, look, this is about the logic of clan warfare. If you're going to stop it, you have to find some formula for shaming people in fairly traditional terms and saying this is not manly, because this is what the whole thing is about. It's about gender, and it's about this particular kind of kinship structure. I'm not saying that would have stopped the war. I think that's far too optimistic, but it might have had a certain effect. Certainly, it would have stopped people from saying, "Oh, there was a lot of hand-wringing. This is a horrible thing. All these women getting raped." Yes, I'm not denying that. In fact, the horror of it precisely is that they were raped for a reason that nobody had to know. Now, to me, that was a missed opportunity for anthropology. And I sometimes kick myself for not trying to write a op-ed piece that might have brought it into some sort of public notice. At that time, I was relatively young and relatively unknown. I think it would have been harder. Now, if I something like that would happen, I would do it like a shot, because to me, that's one obvious way where a very classic anthropological problem can be brought to bear on an international issue. I could go on at length about this kind of thing, but I think the short answer to your question is that what we have to do is to try to keep the baby, get rid of the bathwater. Keep the baby of theory, of the kind of knowledge that we've built up, get rid of the bathwater that's made a mixture of colonial residues and obfuscatory language and self-importance. We are human beings who study human beings. That's what we are by definition. And what that has to mean is a moral imperative that doesn't necessarily lead to optimism, but I think we do have a kind of clarity that in certain situations can be very valuable. And I would argue with also all these students now who are saying in the United States, well, we don't need to read those 1940s and 50s old white men who, Now, I sympathize, of course. I see why this is happening. But the fact is that many of them, Evans Pritchard, prominent among them, struggled against the colonial regimes that they were serving. They were uncomfortable, and their discomfort is very clear in their writings. If that would be more widely understood, I think some of those writings would also be very useful, again, not for just for the teaching of anthropology as a formal discipline, but for understanding the nature of colonialism. So that would be another area where, our teaching itself is an important contribution to righting the wrongs of this world.
I have another question, but I don't know if the audience also wants to join in and ask a question to Professor Herzfeld. While you gather your thoughts, perhaps I ask a very quick question. I'm going to be candid, yes? Which is, you mentioned towards the end you seem to be a fervent supporter of collaborative engagements between anthropologists and, bureaucrats, urban planners, architects, and so on. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about, examples that you find thought-provoking and very useful to think about as.
Well, for example, I think that Akio Gupta's book Red Tape is a very interesting example of somebody who studied a bureaucratic system and showed how it works not only to the disadvantage of its supposed clients, but also to the disadvantage often of the bureaucrats themselves. In my own work on bureaucracy, I'm also trying to show that the bureaucrats are less perhaps to be blamed individually for what they do than to be seen as partially as victims of the system and as being engaged in a system of excuse-making that allows them to operate quite successfully and often in favor of their clients, but in ways that formally would be disapproved. So that's one example. Another piece of my own work that I would mention in this context is where I tried to show the connection between concepts of corruption and heritage. Because if heritage is seen as that pristine, originating good that has been passed on to us from our glorious ancestors, then the flip side of it is the notion of something that corrodes over time, which is what the metaphor of corruption is all about. And I think seeing that also helps us to understand, in some ways, that some of the, I would say, the false pretensions of the nation state. And you know that I'm quite a severe critic of the nation state as an institution, especially as I see it increasingly becoming what I call now the bureaucratic ethno-national state. That we've moved away from the idea of a state made up of citizens who owe their loyalty to the state simply to the fact that they pay taxes to it and get services in exchange, to a state that is defined by sharing a common culture and ethnic identity to such an extent that it then becomes violent in the way it excludes others. A third example is to think about violence not only as the violence of physical action, but also the violence of laws, the violence of discrimination, the violence of women. I think we can do a lot with that as well.
Ines, no, Elena, sorry.
So a few months ago I stumbled upon
A
few months ago I read an article about activism anthropology, and it reminded me of your definition of engaged anthropology. But I was wondering if, in your opinion, there was any difference between like a person that is an activist and an anthropology, and a person that finds himself or herself involved in a political
So, yeah, this is an important question. The first thing I would say is that all anthropology is by its very nature political. There is no way anthropology can avoid being political. Why? Because all social relations are about power, right? And that's what politics is. So whether we're talking about the state, whether we're talking about gender relations, whether we're talking about class, there's always the capacity of some groups of people to control others. So it's going to be political in that sense. And it seems to me that the activism that anthropologists get involved in is always framed as a critique of power. Now, power is not a bad thing in itself, but power is often misused. I have some power because I come from a prestigious university and I have a senior position, and I can use that perhaps to help the community even on the other side of the world. That seems to me to be a good use of that power. I'm also vulnerable to the criticism that somebody from Thailand might make that you're a foreigner, what business do you have muscling in? And I would say, okay, this is something we should debate. Does moral responsibility stop at borders? I would argue that the imposition of national borders is actually one of the most pernicious heritages, if you will, that we have from being colonialism. It's still with us and it's getting worse. And you see what's happening in Russia and Ukraine is a perfect illustration of that. So all anthropology in that sense has to be political. And if you say, but I'm not political, I don't do anything political, my anthropology, that's a political statement too. I don't think there's any way out of it. So, you know, in the end, when somebody claims to be an activist, my question would always be, okay, great, so what are you being an activist about? Whose responsibilities are you talking about? And then we can discuss whether we agree that the cause is a just one or not. I mean, nobody has the right, it seems to me, to say, I represent the right way to do things. I mean, I certainly am not saying that. I'm saying I'm trying to do the best I can in an imperfect world. And I like to think that it's given some people some comfort. I don't think it's done much more than that. But just to, you know, give you an example, I was actually quite worried when my book about the village in Crete came out in Greek that some people would take offense. In fact, actually gave them a great deal of pleasure. And during a time when they were being attacked left, right, and centre, seemed to me actually to be itself a contribution. But, you know, somebody else might say you're encouraging these people in their violent habits. I could give a counter-argument, we could rehearse that one, and probably be at it for the next 6 hours. But the point is that at the end of the day, I would guess that most people in this room share about 80% of their moral commitments anyway. And, you know, the kind of people you find in anthropology mostly have a pretty, I would say, not necessarily well defined, but there's a certain sense of a common moral commitment. And that, you know, in the end, we have to be judged by our fellow humans.
Any other question? This is a wonderful opportunity to take advantage of the presence of Professor Herzfeld. Perhaps this urban planning question. Yeah, so maybe I'm going to push you on the question of moral commitment, of the common moral commitment. And
Okay.
something that I was wondering, just thinking about as you were, putting forward your vision of engaged anthropology. If you were to define that kind, or draw some boundaries to sketch out the main foundations of that common moral commitment of anthropologists that would guide them somehow in putting forward your vision of an engaged anthropology, what would you say, what were the first values that come to your mind?
Equality, but equality in what sense? So I'm not necessarily saying that it's realistic to think that we will all have equal access to the same amount of wealth, and I don't want it to be defined in terms of wealth. One of the problems I see in the world we live in is that the neoliberal economy has been amazingly successful at translating all other forms of value into economic value. And this is a terrible problem, because what it means is now anything you want to have evaluated is going to be evaluated first numerically, and then that number is going to be turned into euros or dollars or something. And so to me, the common moral commitment is the commitment to restore a sense of value that is multiple and all-embracing. We hear a lot of talk about diversity, and you know that's important. And sure, we want to recognize different sexual orientations, physiological features, ethnic backgrounds, all of that, absolutely. But behind all of that, we as human beings are constantly evaluating each other. And it seems to be really important not to lose sight of the capacity we have for upholding and exhibiting and talking about and criticizing sets of values that are not at all economic in nature. There's a fake scientism that is now pervading the world we live in, has produced this thing called the audit culture, so that instead of saying, your article on lineage structure in southern China raised very interesting questions, but leaves some questions unanswered. But I think it's valuable in the sense that it allows us to think through certain specific problems. People will say, the impact factor of your article was 4.2. What does that mean? It's simply a measure of how many people have read it. And it's a totally mendacious measure because it doesn't actually measure how many people slam the article. So, there is some hope for recognition of the multiplicity of value. You and I have talked about this already. The fact that the top universities in almost every country, so certainly this university here, Harvard, I suppose, and Oxford, Cambridge in England, and so on, the top universities are not playing the audit culture game the whole way. They're tempted to play with it because it's all around us and they're precious to do it, but they tend to resist it more successfully. And that's why they remain the top universities, because somehow, in the end, a sense of value that is not reduced to economics, I think, is going to be much more useful to human beings. And we are facing, let's be quite clear about this, with the sort of ecological problems that climate change is bringing, we are going to be facing some very difficult evaluative issues. And we need to know what is important here: moral value, aesthetic value, ethical value, nutritional value. I mean, I could go on a great length. There are lots of different kinds of value. Why should they all be reduced to dollars and cents, to euros and cents? It doesn't make sense. We have to remember that, and I think anthropologists are uniquely qualified. That is one thing I think we can do. We need to write about value. Again, David Graeber, of course, did a lot of that in his sadly short life. I don't agree with everything he said, and I certainly don't agree with a lot of the ways he said things. But he was very good at reminding people that value is something much more than cash. We need to develop, it seems to me, a critique of the way that cash has become the defining measure of everything. And in that, we are going to find that some economists will oppose us tooth and nail, but there are some good economists who will see very clearly. Let me give you an example. There's a group of economists now who recognize that, as they put it, the original sin of newly created nation states lies in the fact that they were indebted before they actually came into being. Now think of what that implies. That's pushing back against the numerical notion of economic value. So there are people in these other social sciences who I think will side with us, but we can take the lead because we study different kinds of value. If you look at early writings that were influential and not so most, it makes it very clear. And in fact, that whole group, sociologists and anthropologists, they were indistinguishable from each other in that particular circle, talked about value in interesting ways. We need to get that back on the front page of our agenda.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if there's another question.
I think you wrote, yes?
Okay, please. We actually have two now. So Paul and then, okay, please. Yeah, and then Paul, sorry.
So a little louder, please, because I'm hungry.
Could you tell me your name?
Bayram.
Okay.
I'm a PhD student in the University of Wimbledon. Good afternoon.
I'm sorry, I'm a little deaf, so yeah.
Thank you so much for your brilliant presentation. And my question maybe it is not related and relevant the subject of this session, but it is about one of your books, the Siege of the Spirit, right? Siege of the Spirit. It is the wonderful book that you wrote. I don't know my harvest about the main idea of this book is right or wrong, but it is a conflict between society and government, right? It is not the whole society, but the part of people, poor people in all parts of the city. For example, Bangkok was the city that you mentioned in the book. And, in this conflict, the government tried to change the face of the city, right? By some excuses like developing the place and the other things. But in your idea, people are the winner of this contest, right? In the social communication. As an anthropologist, as a well-known anthropologist, what are your criteria to assigning to dressing people as a winner in this maybe unequally contest? As you know, they are under the pressure by the government, by the law, and this unequally social communication.
Well, that's an important question. I mean, the criteria do shift. That's the first thing we realize. The idea that we can somehow come up with a single set of criteria does seem to me quite dangerous, because the realities are different from one situation to another. So one city, for example, will have very different needs from another. But I think the point I made earlier about inequality is central, and insecurity as well. Because if we can identify which forms of inequality seem to be causing the greatest level of suffering, what is it that people are really complaining about? We see very quickly, I mean, people complain about all sorts of things, and some of the complaining is superficial, of course, but you see a pattern very quickly. So in a city like Bangkok, where there are certainly many, many poor people, but some of them have homes, the few, not so few anymore, unfortunately, their families especially. And so, rather than trying to take sides morally, saying, the government is wrong, the bureaucrats are wrong, what I try to understand is what are the structural constraints that stop the bureaucrats from doing certain things and force them to do others. How do they understand their role? That's why it's important, even when in your view, and I will be honest, I found the bureaucrats in Bangkok to be horrible, frankly, many of them. I mean, I didn't like them. But I tried to understand why they were acting in the way they did, and soon realized that, in fact, they didn't always have choices. Some did, and that became very clear. And some elected to go in a particular direction because by doing so they would be able to get more promotion. You could see, various forces pushing them in that way. So, again, rather than trying to say they're good and bad people, or that their goals were good or bad, I think these absolute moralities don't work very well. What we need to say, what were they trying to do, and why do we think it's wrong? Now, when you write your account of this, some other people may say, but this is perfectly okay. And that means you have a public debate. So if there is one thing that I think is fundamental to all of this, it's the freedom of speech. It's the freedom of being able to discuss things openly. And again, there have been attempts to shut anthropologists up on many occasions because they speak truth to power. It's a complex question, and I can't give you an absolute answer precisely because we move from one situation to the next. Instinctively, I think what I'm trying to say is that the first thing I look for is forms of inequality that seem to me unnecessarily violent. And by violent, I don't necessarily mean physical violence. I mean, it can be conceptual violence, it can be structural violence, it can be emotional violence. But what are some people acting in a way for personal motives, or are they doing it because the structure of the situation is such they really have very little choice? And I think it's important to do that because a lot of bureaucrats, in fact, do find themselves in that situation, and very often try to help people, even though the law makes it very difficult for them to do so. So, it's the moral dilemma of the anthropologist is at what point you draw the line, and you have to do that situationally. I'm not, I can't endorse any kind of absolute morality here, it wouldn't work. And I think that's what makes some people very uncomfortable with this kind of approach. But surely we all know what good and evil are. No, we don't. Because what looks good, think of something as simple as dietary laws in different cultures, right? So somebody will tell you, well, in my culture, I'm not allowed to eat my religion, I'm not allowed to eat pork, and somebody else says, but it's wrong to eat any kind of meat, and then somebody else says, no, meat was created by, whatever you believe in, to be consumed by human beings. So all of them are speaking from a position of religious conviction. What do you do in that situation? You try to find some space, and this is where, again, space is important. You don't put pork eaters with people who have a pork taboo in the same building, necessarily. Certainly not using the same kitchen. Things of that kind. So, that's a very simplistic example, but if you can extend it to to situations where questions of abuses or manipulations of power involved, I think you can see that there too, there is space for making what are always provisional choices. And one of my teachers at Oxford, Adrian Arthur, used to talk about admirable provisionality. And I think that's exactly what he meant. There's a certain understanding that in human affairs, one has to be willing to accept that whatever we do is going to be challenged at some point. And what looks good to, the colonial administrators, some of them I'm sure were convinced they were doing the right thing, bringing Christianity and running toilets to the benighted natives. We today criticize colonialism, and I think rightly so, but in order to understand its success, we have to understand that it was seen as a moral system. In fact, Andrea Muehlebach has written a very interesting book about neoliberalism. It's called The Moral Neoliberal. She's making precisely that point about neoliberalism. The neoliberals will say to you very seriously, responsibilization is a moral good because people need to be responsible for themselves no matter what their position is like. I would say they're ignoring all of the structural constraints that have led some people to have enormous wealth. I find it appalling that there are billionaires in the world and there are people dying of starvation in the same world. But this has to be discussed with some measure of understanding, even for those billionaires, because if we don't do it, there is no conversation. And it seems to me anthropology is the ultimate conversation about these kinds of issues. So I hope that gives you, it's a provisional answer, because again, admirable provisionality is the right word, but it's the best I can do. And that's what we have to do, the best we can do.
Thank you. Last question.
Okay. We talked about the human form divine, like in anthropology. The human form divine in anthropology, humans. He also thought that if you talk about everything being reduced to dollars and cents, and pounds and euros, and yeah, it's that in an anthropologist sense, we're reducing everything to materiality. When we do that, everybody thought that was real.
I just go to
Right, and so what is the intangible part of it, the immeasurable part of what we talked about? I think it is being cast out by auditing and assessment and all that. That is now replacing. It is meant to replace actual talk, actual confronting the issues that are important issues. I think it's going on in my own teaching. It's more important, that I ask these questions, so that I grade this, and this, than that I ask these questions and ask people to think about it.
Thank you. No, I mean, that's absolutely. But let me say that I think we have to realize that what these purveyors of economic value are actually doing is inflicting not materiality but a false materiality.
Yeah.
I would argue that everything is material, including language, and all values are material. After all, what is the minimal definition in philosophy of the material? It's a cause and effect relationship. So if I say something rude to you and you get angry, that's a material interaction. There's a physical dimension to it. Language is very material. It has real effects. So is material in the same way. So what these purveyors of what I call numerological hocus pocus are really doing is saying we are going to decide that only certain things can be considered material. And that's much more dangerous, because then, there's been, if we take the example of heritage, some people say, well, heritage is what we consider to be what we as a group have inherited as marks of our cultural identity. So Laura Jane Smith has said very wisely, I think, all heritage is intangible. Because people usually say, what do you mean? I mean, point to monuments, they're very tangible. They are, what is intangible about them is the attribution of value, exactly as you said. And I think this is profoundly important, because it makes us realize that the game that the neoliberals are playing, and the game that the auditors, for want of a better word, are playing with us, is precisely not letting us see that what they've selected as important is actually only a very small part of a much larger spectrum. And that allows them to distort our vision. So we need to resist that. If you're interested in this topic, the book that I would most strongly recommend is an edited volume by Marilyn Strasser, just called Audit Cultures, and she really goes into it, and not only she. The term was originally coined, I think, by Chris Shaw and Susan Wright, and they have an important essay in that volume as well. And it's now, we talk about audit culture all the time, and universities are subjected to it in ways that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. But it has to be resisted, and I'm glad you raised the issue. It's not just based on a false materiality, it's also based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what value is. Value is a human relation. anthropologists study it.
Thank you very much,
Okay,
Michael.
well, thank you.
Please join me in thanking Michael Herzfeld.